The confrontation had been building for months. Frank Lucas had committed an unforgivable sin in the eyes of the Italian families. He had become too successful. By 1971, Frank was moving more heroin through Harlem than any dealer in American history. His Blue Magic brand had become legendary purer product at lower prices, supplied through a direct connection to Southeast Asia that bypassed every Italian middleman who had traditionally controlled the drug trade. The Italians had tolerated black dealers for decades, as long as those dealers bought their product from Italian suppliers. The arrangement kept everyone in their place. Italians at the top, taking the largest cut, black dealers at the bottom, doing the dangerous street work for a fraction of the profit. Frank Lucas had shattered that arrangement completely. He wasn't buying from anyone. He was importing directly, cutting the Italians out of the most profitable drug market in the country. Worse, he was expanding his network, reaching into territories the Italian families considered their own. His prices undercutting dealers who depended on Italian supply. The families had discussed the problem at their regular meetings. Some wanted to kill Frank immediately, send a message about what happened to those who disrupted the established order. Others urged patience. Killing Frank would create chaos in Harlem, draw attention from law enforcement, potentially spark a war nobody could afford. Carmine Galante was not a patient man. The restaurant was called Patsy's, an Italian place in East Harlem that had served as neutral territory for decades. Frank ate there regularly, not because the food was exceptional, but because being seen there communicated something important. It said he was unafraid. It said he could operate in Italian territory without asking permission. That night, Frank was dining with two associates, discussing business matters that had nothing to do with the Italian families. He had no security visible, no bodyguards at adjacent tables, no soldiers positioned near the exits. Just three black men in expensive suits eating pasta in a restaurant where they were clearly the only non-Italians present. Some called this arrogance. Others called it stupidity. Frank called it strategy. He knew the Italians were watching him, knew they were calculating whether he was worth the risk of elimination. By appearing in their territory without obvious protection, he was communicating confidence, suggesting that he had resources they couldn't see, connections that would make moving against him costly. It was a calculated gamble. That night, the calculation was about to be tested. Galante entered the restaurant at 9:47 p.m. Frank noted the time because timing was information, and information was survival. The two soldiers with Galante were men. Frank recognized Joey Massino and Cesare Bonventre, both known for violence, both absolutely loyal to their boss. They positioned themselves to block any exit while Galante continued toward Frank's table. The restaurant was approximately two-thirds full, maybe 40 people, mostly Italian, many of them connected in various ways to the families. They were witnesses, and they knew they were witnesses. Whatever happened here would be discussed in kitchens and social clubs across the city by morning. Galante stopped 3 feet from Frank's table. His soldiers remained at the door, creating a visible perimeter that emphasized the seriousness of what was about to happen. Frank Lucas. Frank looked up from his steak. His expression showed mild interest, nothing more. "Mr. Galante, nice to see you. Would you like to sit down?" The offer was precisely calibrated to be offensive. You didn't invite Carmine Galante to sit at your table like he was a business associate. You stood. You showed respect. You acknowledged the hierarchy that governed the world they both inhabited. Frank did none of those things. Galante's face tightened. He had come here expecting fear, or at least caution. He had not expected to be treated like a minor inconvenience. "You've been causing problems," Galante said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent restaurant. "Selling in places you shouldn't sell. Taking money that belongs to other people. I sell where there are customers. I take money from people who buy my product. That's called business. That's called disrespect. Galante leaned forward, his hands planted on the edge of Frank's table. You're cutting into arrangements that have existed for 30 years. You think because you're making money, the rules don't apply to you? Frank set down his knife and fork, giving Galante his full attention for the first time. His expression remained calm, almost pleasant. Which rules are those exactly? The rules where I buy diluted garbage from your people at inflated prices? The rules where I do all the work and you take half the profit? Those rules? The rules that keep everybody alive. Your rules keep you alive, Mr. Galante. They keep your families rich. They don't do anything for me except take money out of my pocket. Galante straightened, his posture shifting from intimidation to something more dangerous. His right hand moved slightly toward his jacket, a gesture so small that most people in the restaurant probably missed it. Frank didn't miss it. I'm going to give you a choice, Galante said, his voice dropping to a register that witnesses later described as almost gentle. You can start buying from our suppliers again. Pay the tribute you owe for operating in our territory. Show proper respect to people who deserve respect. Or what? The interruption was a provocation. You didn't interrupt Carmine Galante mid-threat. You listened, you absorbed, you showed appropriate fear. Galante's expression went cold. Or, this is the last dinner you ever eat. The threat landed in absolute silence. Nobody in that restaurant doubted that Galante meant exactly what he said. He had killed men for lesser offenses than what Frank Lucas had done to the established order. Frank picked up his wine glass, took a slow sip, and set it back down with deliberate precision. Are you finished? Galante looked genuinely confused. This was not how people responded to death threats from him. They begged, they negotiated, they made promises they couldn't keep and proposed compromises they couldn't deliver. They did not calmly drink wine and ask if he was finished. You think I'm joking? I think you came here to scare me, Frank said. I think you expected me to fold, to agree to whatever terms you wanted, to get back in the box where you think I belong. He paused, meeting Galante's eyes directly. But I'm not in any box, and I don't scare. Then you're stupid. Stupid would be depending on your supply chain when I have my own. Stupid would be paying tribute for the privilege of doing business in neighborhoods your families don't even control. Stupid would be showing weakness right now, in this restaurant, in front of all these people who are watching to see what happens. Frank gestured slightly at the surrounding diners, many of whom quickly looked away. You came here to make a point. You've made it. Everyone knows Carmine Galante threatened Frank Lucas in public. Now they're going to see what I do about it. Galante faced a decision. He had made his threat. The response had been unexpected defiance. Now he had to choose between escalation and retreat. Killing Frank here and now was possible. Galante was armed. His soldiers were positioned. The restaurant was full of witnesses who could be intimidated into silence or eliminated if necessary. But the consequences of that choice were significant. Frank Lucas had connections that extended beyond Harlem. He had relationships with corrupt police officers, with politicians, with federal contacts who found his information useful. He had family members positioned throughout his organization, brothers, cousins, people whose loyalty was absolute and whose desire for revenge would be inevitable. More importantly, Frank's death in an Italian restaurant would be understood throughout the criminal underworld as a declaration of war. Black dealers across the country would see it as a message about their own disposability. Some would submit to Italian authority. Others would resist, creating conflicts that would draw law enforcement attention and damage business for everyone. Galante had built his reputation on violence, but he was not stupid. Violence was a tool, and tools were only useful when they produced desired outcomes. This situation had become more complicated than a simple public humiliation. The restaurant remained frozen while Galante processed his options. 40 sets of eyes watched the confrontation, understanding that they were seeing something that would be discussed for years. Among those witnesses was a man named Anthony Salerno, a capo with the Genovese family, who had been dining with associates at a corner table. Salerno had no particular affection for Frank Lucas, but he had even less interest in watching Galante start a war that would affect all the families. He caught Galante's eye and gave an almost imperceptible shake of his head. Another witness was a woman named Maria Caruso, whose husband was a made man with the Colombo family. She would later tell her husband what she had seen, and he would tell others, and the story would spread through channels that connected every level of organized crime in the city. The witnesses mattered because their presence transformed a private dispute into a public performance. Whatever Galante decided, his decision would become common knowledge. If he killed Frank, he would be seen as decisive but reckless. If he backed down, he would be seen as weak. There was no option that preserved his reputation entirely. Frank Lucas understood this dynamic perfectly. It was why he had chosen this restaurant, this night, this particular visibility for his confrontation with the Italian power structure. "You're making a mistake," Galante said finally. "Maybe, but it's my mistake to make. I could end this right now. End you right now. Everyone here would understand. Everyone here would understand that you murdered an unarmed man over a business dispute. Everyone here would tell everyone they know, and everyone would start asking questions about what happens next, about who's really in control, about whether the old rules still apply." Frank's voice remained steady, conversational, as if they were discussing the weather rather than his potential death. "You want to kill me, Mr. Galante? Do it. But know what comes after. Know that my people won't stop until they've taken something from you, your business, your family, your life. Know that the attention you bring down on all of us benefits no one. Know that this moment, right here, is the best outcome you're going to get." And what outcome is that? We both walk away. I continue operating where I operate. You continue operating where you operate. Our paths don't cross again. Simple. The silence stretched for what witnesses later estimated was almost a full minute. Galante stood over Frank's table, his soldiers still positioned at the door, the entire restaurant holding its breath. Then Galante laughed. It wasn't a genuine laugh. There was no warmth in it, no surrender. But it was an acknowledgement of something, a shift in the dynamics of the confrontation. "You've got balls, Lucas. I'll give you that. I've got what I need to survive in this business." Galante straightened his jacket, a gesture that seemed almost unconscious but communicated volumes to everyone watching. He was stepping back, not retreating. Carmine Galante would never characterize this as retreat, but recognizing that this particular confrontation had reached its conclusion. "This isn't over," he said. "Nothing's ever over. But it's over for tonight." Galante turned and walked toward the exit. His soldiers fell in behind him, the three men departing with the same deliberate menace with which they had arrived. The door closed behind them. Frank Lucas didn't move for almost a minute after Galante left. He sat perfectly still, staring at the door, making certain that the departure was genuine and not a prelude to something worse. Then he picked up his fork and resumed eating his steak. The gesture was performance as much as anything else. His appetite had vanished the moment Galante walked through that door. But the witnesses needed to see Frank Lucas finish his meal, pay his bill, and walk out of that restaurant like nothing extraordinary had happened. That was the point. That was always the point. He finished his dinner. He ordered dessert. He tipped generously. And when he finally left Patsy's at 10:45 p.m., he walked slowly to his car, got in without looking around, and drove away. The story was already spreading before his car cleared the block. Within 24 hours, Everyone who mattered knew what had happened at Patsy's. The details varied slightly depending on who was telling the story, but the core remained consistent. Carmine Galante had threatened Frank Lucas in public, and Frank Lucas had not blinked. The implications were significant. For the Italian families, it was a signal that the old order was changing. A black dealer had faced down one of their most feared enforcers and survived. The monopoly they had held over the drug trade for decades was eroding, and violence alone might not be enough to restore it. For black criminals throughout the city, it was a different kind of signal. Frank Lucas had demonstrated that standing up to the Italians was possible, that defiance didn't automatically mean death. His success created aspirations and complications that would reshape organized crime in New York for years to come. For Frank himself, the confrontation marked a shift from successful dealer to something more. He had become a symbol, a figure whose name carried weight beyond the scale of his operation. People who had never met him told stories about what he had done. His reputation grew exponentially. Carmine Galante did not forget the humiliation he had suffered. He was not the kind of man who let grievances go unanswered, who accepted setbacks without seeking revenge. But the revenge never came, at least not in the form everyone expected. Galante made several attempts to undermine Frank's operation over the following years. He tried to disrupt supply lines, to turn Frank's associates against him, to create problems that would force Frank to come begging for the peace he had rejected. None of it worked. Frank's supply chain was too well protected. His organization was too loyal. His connections with corrupt officials were too valuable for those officials to abandon. The infrastructure he had built was simply too robust to be destroyed by traditional mob tactics. Galante eventually shifted his focus to other concerns. He had his own enemies, his own problems, his own ambitions that demanded attention. The confrontation at Patsy's became one of many grievances he carried, significant but not all-consuming. In 1979, Carmine Galante was assassinated, shot while eating lunch at a Brooklyn restaurant, dying amid the pasta and cigars he had enjoyed. His killers were members of his own family, men who had grown tired of his violence and his arrogance. Frank Lucas survived him by decades. People who heard the story often asked the same question. Why didn't Galante kill Frank that night? He had the capability. He had the reputation. He had every reason to eliminate a man who was openly defying the established order. The answer revealed something important about power and violence, and the complex calculations that governed the criminal underworld. Galante didn't kill Frank because killing him would have cost too much, not in money or resources, but in the chaos that would follow, the attention that would be drawn, the precedent that would be set. The risk outweighed the benefit. Frank understood this calculus better than Galante did. He had structured his position specifically to make his elimination expensive. He had built redundancies into his organization, cultivated relationships with people who would pursue revenge, created a profile that would make his death a major event rather than a quiet disappearance. By the time Galante walked into Patsy's, Frank had already done the work that would protect him. The confrontation itself was just theater, important theater, but theater nonetheless. The real battle had been fought in the years before, in the construction of an operation that couldn't be easily destroyed. Frank Lucas didn't survive that night because he was tougher than Carmine Galante or because he had more soldiers or better weapons. He survived because he understood something that many people in his position never grasped. That survival in the criminal world was ultimately about making your elimination more costly than your continued existence. Galante could have killed Frank, but killing Frank would have meant war with an organization that was prepared for war. It would have meant law enforcement attention that would damage Italian operations. It would have meant setting a precedent that encouraged other black dealers to resist rather than submit. The math didn't work. So, Galante walked away. This didn't mean the threat wasn't real. It didn't mean Frank wasn't in genuine danger during those 15 minutes at Patsy's. The possibility of violence was always present when dealing with men like Galante, but Frank had done everything possible to shift the calculation in his favor. When the moment of confrontation came, when he had to choose between showing fear and showing strength, he chose strength not because he wasn't afraid, but because showing fear would have changed the calculation in ways that made his death more likely. He didn't blink because blinking would have killed him. Frank Lucas's empire eventually fell not to Italian violence, but to federal investigation. The same visibility that had protected him from the mob eventually drew the attention of law enforcement officers who couldn't be bought or intimidated. But the confrontation at Patsy's remained part of his legend. It was told and retold in Harlem barbershops and Brooklyn social clubs. It appeared in biographies and documentaries and the various retellings that accumulated around Frank Lucas's story. The confrontation endured because it captured something essential about how power actually works. Not through guns or soldiers or threats, but through calculation, through understanding what your adversary wants, what they fear, what they're willing to pay to achieve their goals. Carmine Galante wanted respect, compliance, the restoration of an order that Frank Lucas was disrupting. Frank understood that giving Galante what he wanted would destroy everything he had built, so he refused. He sat in that restaurant, ate his steak, and showed 40 witnesses that Frank Lucas didn't blink when threatened by the most dangerous man in New York. That was the moment. That was the story, and that was why it mattered. If this story changed how you think about power, about confrontation, about the calculations that determine who survives and who doesn't subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to understand that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's the decision that something else matters more. Drop a comment. What would you have done at that table?